But let's jump into some NBC Rotoworld headlines. Let's start off with a man that you know very well. You wore a T-shirt last week saying, "Make Carson Wentz great again."
I got to get a new T-shirt that says, I was going to say, I need a new T-shirt that says, "Make Carson Wentz whole again."
Yes, because he has a broken finger on his throwing hand. Yeah. We expect that he's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. So firstly, how does this affect the Commanders' offense?
Statement from the Commanders out there was that, that he'd fractured a finger, he's undergone successful surgery, but they just announced this, just in here, as expected, as I tweeted out yesterday. Taylor Heinicke, officially from the Commanders, I'm reading here an announcement. Taylor Heinicke will start at quarterback this Sunday versus Green Bay. Hashtag GB versus Washington. Hashtag HTTC. Hail to the Commanders. Hail victory. So Taylor Heinicke is your starting quarterback for your Washington Commanders. I know you love them.
I love myself some Commanders.
If there's a positive here, is that the offense is still fantasy friendly. Like through 6 weeks in the NFL, even with that brutal Bears game last week, the Commanders are top 6 in the NFL in pass attempts per game. Like they're throwing. We're throwing. Taylor Heinicke was a top 20 quarterback in fantasy points per game last year, and that was without Jahan Dotson, without Curtis Samuel, without Logan Thomas. Like a much worse team last year, I think. So, look, Heinicke is a little bit inaccurate, but ultimately, I think he's a viable streamer if you're in if you're in a 2-quarterback league, you're in a superflex league, and you're in a 12-team league. If you're looking here, look, Jalen Hurts is out this week. Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, Josh Allen. Like 4 quarterbacks, other than Stafford, 3 quarterbacks that are very viable fantasy starters, and then Stafford, who's like a borderline starter, plus Wentz. Wentz, who's been a good fantasy quarterback this year, even though he hasn't been necessarily the most consistent NFL quarterback. So I do think, and again, we'll get into quarterback waivers here in a little bit, but I think Heinicke is he's a good enough backup that I think he's a viable streamer in the right matchup, Jay. And I also think, to the extent that you care for your pass catchers, Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, he is good enough to be able to get the ball to those guys.
Yep, he's shown that he can put up garbage time yards. Terry McLaurin last year was wide receiver 25. I think if he could be wide receiver 25 going forward, that's a win based on what he's shown so far. The Commanders are 5.5-point dogs to the broken Green Bay Packers in Washington on Sunday, so expect that they'll be throwing. And we look at Terry McLaurin's stats with Taylor Heinicke in the 2021 season. He had 7+ targets in 11 of the 16 games played, 11+ in 4 of those games. 4 games with 90+ receiving yards, and weeks 1 to 4, Terry McLaurin was wide receiver 6 in fantasy, putting up around 20 points per game.
Yeah, again, I mean, McLaurin was all they had last year because they didn't have Dotson. Samuel was hurt. So I don't expect him to get as much of a narrow target tree this year with the offense the Commanders are running, but certainly there's a connection there with Heinicke and McLaurin. McLaurin is still the number 1 wide receiver, so you're likely starting McLaurin this week against Green Bay. Let me put it this way. I don't think the change from Wentz to Heinicke would be a reason to bench McLaurin if you'd been planning on starting him this week. Same with Curtis Samuel.
Okay, let's jump to the Cardinals. The news broke just after we got off air yesterday that they had acquired the much maligned Robbie Anderson from the Carolina Panthers, and Marquise Brown is reportedly out 6 weeks with a foot fracture, and we have a little sound from Cliff Kingsbury on that situation.
Was the Anderson trade a direct result of worrying that you weren't going to have Hollywood for a while?
Yeah, I think so. Had an opportunity to get a guy that brings some speed and that dynamic that Hollywood has, and so we'll kind of see where he fits in. And just for the long term, with guys getting hurt, we need some more wideouts in here.
Is there any realistic hope that Anderson could be available to play Sunday on
Thursday? Yeah, I would say so. We'll get him in, see what we can fit in once again. Without getting on the grass, actually going full speed, we want to make sure that he's confident when he's out there. So if he does play, it would be a limited package.
You're picking up Robbie Anderson.
What?
You're picking up Robbie Anderson?
No.
Okay. Done? No.
I mean,
Bye-bye, Robbie.
Here's the thing. So I did a video right after the news broke. And I did just like a selfie video, and I basically said my take on this isn't that suddenly Robbie Anderson has a big jump in value, although he does. I mean, I got to caveat this. There's a jump in value for Robbie Anderson just because he's leaving the blank show that is Carolina and the quarterback situation there, and he's going to Kyler Murray. Yep. Right? That's a better situation for any wide receiver. So there's an uptick, I suppose, in value for Robbie Anderson. Having said that, I'm not going to pick him out. Like, DeAndre Hopkins is back. And I said, what I said in the video is, I said, my assumption is this means Marquise Brown, who was spotted in a walking boot after the game, is more hurt than we thought. Suddenly, a bunch of different reports, about an hour after I posted that, came out. There was concern that Marquise Brown had suffered a season-ending injury. More tests revealed that it wasn't that severe, so great news there. But as you heard, like probably 4 to 6 weeks there on Hollywood Brown. We'll see. Obviously, he's not going to play this Thursday night against the Saints. You heard the sound there from Cliff Kingsbury saying that if Robbie Anderson's active, it would be a small package of plays. Even with Hollywood Brown out, you've still got DeAndre Hopkins back. You've got Rondale Moore, who's getting a ton of touches. Zach Ertz is a big part of this passing attack. They use the running back in the passing game here. Could Robbie Anderson catch a long one for a touchdown 3 times the rest of the way? Sure, of course, and have a useful fantasy day. But the idea that where you know where those games are coming, I don't know. Like the fact of the matter is that if this game against the Saints were 3 weeks from now, you might think about it just because you're like, the Saints can be beaten deep. We saw it with Chase last week, like we've seen it with the Seahawks 2 weeks ago. Like, you can throw deep on New Orleans. And so if Anderson's running a ton of snaps, but like, it's just such a narrow window here where he's probably going to get like 10 snaps, and you're hoping he gets deep for one of them on Thursday night against the Saints. I'm not rushing to pick up Robbie Anderson. I think it's a better NFL move for the Cardinals than it is for fantasy managers.
Yeah, and look, last year Kyler Murray threw the ball deep almost as much as anyone. I think it was 15% of his passes went 20 yards downfield or more, and you just think like, all right, well, Kyler Anderson throwing deep, Robbie Anderson a deep threat, but also you have to factor in that Robbie Anderson isn't that good at the moment, and also just because he's going to be running deep, like if they sign Deshaun Jackson, Deshaun Jackson's a deep threat, doesn't mean you're rushing to pick up Deshaun Jackson. So I do think that with DeAndre Hopkins coming back, yes, Marquise Brown, who has more targets this year than Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, those targets have to get reallocated somewhere, but it's going to go to Hopkins. It's going to go to a guy we're going to talk about in Rondale Moore as well. There are a lot of bodies on that team.
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBC Sports and Rotoworld.com. Just want to thank you so much for watching what you just watched, or at least being too lazy to click out of it after the autoplay just kept it going. So either way, thank you so much for just letting it scroll by your screen. And now I'd like to ask you respectfully, please subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel for the latest NFL news, fantasy headlines from Rotoworld, and betting analysis from NBC Sports Edge.